The church is supposed to be the most glorious, powerful, and influential organism on this planet. But when we look at the state of the church across the globe, we need to recognize that she's not what she ought to be. As we study God's Word and the history of God's people, I believe we can identify two major issues that have caused God's people to move away from His purposes. The first has to do with how we view the church, and the second has to do with how we view spiritual leadership. Let's take a look. In the book of Exodus, we have the account of how God rescued His people and called them out of Egypt to become His treasured possession, a holy nation, and a kingdom of priests. This is God's vision for His people, the ecclesia, God's called out ones. The church is called out of the world as God's chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people belonging to God. We are a kingdom of priests. In Exodus chapter 20, we then see how the people were afraid of God and did not want to face the consequences of drawing near to Him. So they remained at a distance and asked Moses to relate to God for them. In other words, instead of relating to God directly as a kingdom of priests, they abdicated their spiritual responsibility and depended on Moses to relate to God for them. The problem with that was that when Moses was on the mountain with God, they used his absence and Aaron's weakness as an excuse to sin. Having abdicated their spiritual responsibility to fear God and to relate to God directly, they now blamed their leaders for their idolatry and sin. So we see how the natural man resists taking responsibility for his own relationship with God and prefers to pass on that responsibility to other people or leaders, and then use their apparent absence or weakness as an excuse to sin or live a life that is inferior to the life God intended for them. What we need to realize is that the church has adopted a model that supports this behavior. Instead of living as a kingdom of priests, with everyone taking responsibility for their own walk with God and going up the mountain themselves, we hand over that responsibility to leaders, allowing them to become our excuse or our ceiling in our walk with God. You see, what has happened is that we have taken the model of the temple that was given to foreshadow Christ's high priestly ministry and used that as a model for the church. Think about it. The point is, there is only one mediator, and we are called to be priests in His kingdom. I believe God is calling each one of us up the mountain to grow in our relationship with Him and to become all that God has intended for us. No leader or person can stop you from going up the mountain unless you allow them to be your ceiling or your excuse. God is calling you to a higher life in Him, in which you live as a priest, serving the Lord and becoming the best version of yourself as God intended. To help us change the way we think about church and spiritual leadership, consider these questions. Are you looking to any person or leader as your standard to measure your walk with God? Have you abdicated your spiritual responsibility as a priest in God's kingdom? Have you blamed leaders for your own sin or for living an inferior Christian life? Has anyone been a ceiling or an excuse in your own walk with God? Are you going up the mountain to be the priest God has chosen you to be? Will you approach the thick darkness like Moses and allow God to deal with you so that He can take you higher? I encourage you to read Exodus chapter 19 verses 4 to 6, 1 Peter chapter 2 verse 9, and Revelation chapter 1 verses 5 and 6 to understand God's vision for the church and how He's called us out of the world to be a kingdom of priests. Then I'll also encourage you to meditate on Exodus chapter 20 verses 18 to 21 to understand the issue of abdicating one's spiritual responsibility. And then chapter 32 to understand what can happen when we only depend on leaders or people for our spiritual growth. Finally, we can get a glimpse of what a kingdom of priests looks like in Acts chapter 2, verses 42 to 47, that reveals how all the believers devoted themselves to the Lord and His purposes. I want to encourage you to go up the mountain and enter the thick darkness, the mystery of God, so that you can grow in your knowledge of Him and His purpose for your life. He wants to take you higher. I'm convinced that as each one of us lives as a priest in God's kingdom, we will be the most glorious, powerful, and influential people on this planet. God bless you.